Good evening, friends. Tonight, we'll drift slowly into the sands of ancient Mesopotamia, where beneath layers of time and desert dust, clay tablets whispered secrets that scholars would puzzle over for centuries. Allow yourself to settle in now. Dim your lights if you haven't already. Rest your head gently on your pillow, and let the weight of the day begin to slip away from your shoulders. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your part of the world? Whether you're watching the stars appear through your window or the first light of dawn is still hours away, you're exactly where you need to be. Let your breathing soften, slow and steady, as we journey together through a story that unfolded more than 4,000 years ago. If this peaceful journey helps you unwind, feel free to like and subscribe, only if it feels right to you. There's no rush, no pressure. Just you, this moment, and the gentle pull of an ancient mystery. Tonight, we'll explore how cuneiform tablets revealed an alliance between city-states that should have been rivals, how trade routes carried more than goods, and how an agreement etched in clay vanished as mysteriously as morning mist. So take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, let yourself sink a little deeper into comfort. Our story begins now, in the warm glow of oil lamps and the patient scratch of reed styluses on wet clay. Imagine, if you will, the city of Lagash in the year 2400 BCE, when the morning sun painted the ziggurat towers in shades of honey and amber. The air carried the scent of barley bread baking in outdoor ovens, that warm, yeasty fragrance that made even the earliest risers smile as they passed through the narrow streets. In one particular scriptorium, a young scribe named Uarnansha sat cross-legged on a woven reed mat, his fingers carefully pressing a stylus into a fresh clay tablet that was still cool and damp to the touch. The scribal schools of Sumer were places of remarkable dedication. Boys as young as 7 would begin their training, spending years mastering the hundreds of wedge-shaped signs that made up the cuneiform writing system. It's a bit like learning to write with a combination of triangles and lines, each cluster of marks representing sounds, words, or entire concepts. Uarnansha had been studying for 12 years now, and his hand moved with the confidence of long practice. The tablet before him wasn't recording grain taxes or temple donations, though. This one held something far more intriguing. Let me share with you what made this particular tablet special. In the soft light filtering through the reed-covered window, Uarnansha was copying a diplomatic letter, word for word, from an older tablet that had arrived just 3 days prior from the city of Umma. Now, if you know anything about Sumerian history, you might remember that Lagash and Umma had been bitter rivals for generations. They'd fought over irrigation rights, over boundary stones, over strips of fertile land that lay between their territories. Wars had been waged. Blood had soaked into the soil. And yet, here was a letter speaking of cooperation, of shared interests, of an alliance that seemed to contradict everything the historical record suggested. The tablet spoke of trade agreements, yes, but also of something more. There were references to the Northern Concern, a phrase that appeared 17 times in the document, always with a peculiar sign that modern archaeologists would later struggle to interpret. Was it a threat? A shared enemy? A natural disaster they feared? The text remained frustratingly vague, as if the writers assumed the recipient would already understand the context. You might find this little detail soothingly interesting. The Sumerians loved their beer. In fact, they had a goddess dedicated to brewing named Ninkasi, and they'd composed a hymn to her that doubled as a recipe. The workers who built the great monuments and dug the irrigation canals received a portion of their wages in beer rations, roughly 3 to 5 liters per day depending on their role. Imagine finishing a long day of hauling limestone blocks and sitting down to a clay vessel of thick, sweet barley beer, slightly sour from the fermentation, with bits of grain still floating on the surface. You drink it through a reed straw to avoid the sediment. On the tablet Yuarnansha was copying, there was a notation about beer shipments from Amma to Lagash, specifically a dark variety brewed with dates that gave it a rich, molasses-like sweetness. As his stylus moved across the clay, Yuarnansha paused occasionally to dip it in water, keeping the wedge-shaped tip clean. The scriptorium was quiet except for the gentle scratch of reed on clay and the distant calls of vendors in the marketplace. Outside, someone was roasting onions and garlic, that savory aroma drifting in on the breeze and making his stomach rumble softly. Onions had been cultivated in Mesopotamia for thousands of years by this point, and they appeared in nearly every meal. The Sumerians would layer them with mutton fat and herbs, sometimes adding a sprinkle of ground cumin that had traveled all the way from the Indus Valley along trade routes that connected distant civilizations. But let's return to our tablet. The alliance it described wasn't just about trade or temporary peace. There were clauses about military cooperation, about sharing intelligence, about coordinated responses to this mysterious northern concern. One passage mentioned watchtowers to be built at specific locations, their fires visible from one city to another, creating a communication network that could relay warnings within hours rather than days. It's surprisingly sophisticated when you think about it. These weren't simple farmers scratching out a living. They were architects of complex political strategies, and they understood the power of information. Yuarnansha finished the final line and set down his stylus. The tablet would need to dry slowly in the shade, then be carefully stored in the temple archives where clay documents were kept in neat rows on wooden shelves, organized by subject and date. Some tablets from this period would survive for millennia, preserved by the very fires that destroyed the buildings they were stored in. When a city burned, the extreme heat would bake the clay tablets as hard as stone, turning what should have been fragile documents into nearly indestructible records. It's one of history's little ironies that destruction sometimes preserves. There's something comforting about this part of the story, about imagining this young scribe completing his work with such care, never knowing that thousands of years later, people would still be reading his words, still trying to puzzle out the secrets he was copying. He probably went home that evening to a simple dinner of barley porridge sweetened with honey, that golden amber honey that Sumerian beekeepers had been harvesting since at least 2500 BC. They kept clay cylinder hives and understood the relationship between bees and flowering crops. A spoonful of that ancient honey would have tasted of desert flowers and date palm blossoms, thick and fragrant on the tongue. As Yuarnansha walked home through the evening streets, the sky turning that deep blue that comes just before true darkness, he might have thought about the words he'd copied. Did he wonder what the northern concern was? Did he worry about the alliance between his city and their old enemy? Or was he simply thinking about dinner and rest, about the way the cool evening breeze felt after a day in the warm scriptorium? The tablets he and other scribes copied that season would be discovered in 1877 CE by a French archaeological team digging at a site called Tello. They'd find thousands of tablets, many of them damaged, fragmentary, tantalizingly incomplete. But among them were these diplomatic letters, these hints of an alliance that historical records from neighboring regions never mentioned. It was as if this cooperation had been deliberately kept quiet, or perhaps its memory had been carefully erased after whatever happened next. In the distance, the evening call to prayer rose from the ziggurat temple, a long, melodious chant that signaled the end of the working day. Oil lamps were being lit in the windows. Children were being called in from the streets. And somewhere in the temple archives, that damp clay tablet sat in the darkness, holding its secrets, beginning its long journey through time to reach us here. Tonight, as you lie comfortable and warm, your breathing slow and steady, ready to drift deeper into this ancient mystery. Allow yourself to sink a little further into your pillow now. Let the image of that evening in Lagash fade gently into the background of your mind. The story continues, but there's no hurry. We have all the time we need. The trade route between Lagash and Amma had existed for centuries, a well-worn path that followed the irrigation canals through the flat Mesopotamian landscape. But in the spring of 2398 BCE, something changed. The merchants who traveled this route began to notice small differences. Additional guards at the city gates. New inspection procedures for cargo. And most curious of all, certain goods that had never been restricted before were suddenly being monitored carefully by officials who carried clay tokens marked with the seal of both cities. Let me introduce you to Inasir, a merchant whose name we know from tablets that survived, though not the same infamous Inasir who would later become famous for selling substandard copper. This Inasir specialized in textiles, particularly the fine linen that was woven in Lagash's temple workshops. The flax for this linen was grown in fields along the Tigris River, harvested when the plants were still green to produce the softest fibers, then processed through a lengthy procedure of retting, drying, and spinning that could take months. On this particular morning, Inasir was preparing a caravan of 6 donkeys, each laden with bundles of linen wrapped in protective reed mats. The fabric ranged from everyday weaves suitable for work tunics to gossamer-thin material so delicate it seemed to shimmer in the light, destined for the wardrobes of Amma's elite. He'd made this journey dozens of times, but today felt different. 2 soldiers had joined his party, ostensibly to protect against bandits, but Nasir noticed they seemed more interested in watching the horizon than guarding the cargo. The route took 3 days under normal circumstances. You'd leave at dawn when the air was still cool, that beautiful hour when the desert took on shades of purple and rose, and travel until midday when the heat became oppressive. Then you'd rest in whatever shade you could find, perhaps beneath a date palm or in the shadow of an abandoned way station, dozing fitfully while the sun blazed overhead. Late afternoon would bring another stretch of walking, and by evening you'd make camp, building a small fire for warmth as the desert temperature dropped sharply. You might find it interesting that ancient travelers often carried a peculiar snack called mukaru, which was essentially dried fish paste mixed with sesame seeds and formed into small cakes. It sounds unusual to our modern palates, but it was lightweight, didn't spoil, and provided substantial energy for long journeys. The sesame seeds added a nutty crunch, while the fish paste offered concentrated protein. Nasir had a pouch of these cakes tied to his belt, along with a water skin and a smaller bag containing dried dates, those wrinkled nuggets of intense sweetness that had fueled desert travelers since time immemorial. On the second day of travel, the caravan passed a series of low hills that marked the disputed territory between the 2 city-states. This land had changed hands multiple times, and you could still see the remnants of old boundary stones, some toppled, others deliberately defaced. But what caught Inasir's attention was something new, a watchtower that definitely hadn't been there during his last journey 6 weeks prior. It was a simple structure, just a raised platform of mud brick with a thatched roof to provide shade, but stationed at the top were 2 men with a supply of oil-soaked reeds, ready to send smoke signals. The soldiers traveling with the caravan exchanged glances but said nothing. They continued walking, the donkey's hooves raising small puffs of dust with each step. The sun beat down, and Nasir found himself thinking about the cool interior of his house back in Lagash, about the courtyard with its small fountain where water trickled over smooth stones into a shallow pool. His wife would be weaving in the shade, and his children would be at their lessons. He tried to remember if he'd told his eldest son about checking the measurements on that new shipment of raw flax. These small domestic concerns occupied his mind as the landscape slowly changed from familiar to foreign. By evening of the second day, they made camp near a small shrine dedicated to the god Ninjashida, a deity associated with the underworld and vegetation, often depicted as a serpent or sometimes as a young man with serpents emerging from his shoulders. Travelers would leave small offerings here, usually a bit of food or a small clay figurine. Nasir contributed a handful of barley grains and a small piece of flatbread he'd been saving, nutty and dense with a hint of olive oil worked into the dough. Olive oil had recently become more available through trade with regions to the west, and it was prized for its rich, fruity flavor that transformed even simple bread into something special. As night fell and the stars emerged in extraordinary numbers across the desert sky, the soldiers built up the fire and began talking quietly. Nasir, sitting close enough to hear but pretending to be absorbed in adjusting a donkey's pack, caught fragments of their conversation. They spoke of movements in the north, of strangers seen near the mountain passes, of concerns that had reached the palace officials. There was that phrase again, the northern concern. It appeared in their conversation naturally, casually, as if everyone understood what it meant. What could it have been? Modern historians have proposed various theories. Some suggest it was the early movements of peoples who would later become the Gudians, mountain tribes who would eventually sweep down and bring temporary chaos to the Sumerian civilization. Others propose it might have been related to climate changes that were affecting crop yields across the region, creating pressure for resources. Still others wonder if it was something more mundane, a powerful merchant coalition threatening to disrupt traditional trade relationships, or perhaps a religious movement that the established city-state priests viewed with suspicion. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks drifting upward into the darkness. Somewhere in the distance, a desert fox called out, a sharp, lonely sound. Nasir pulled his woolen cloak tighter. These cloaks were woven from the wool of fat-tailed sheep, animals that had been domesticated in the region for thousands of years. Their wool was coarse but warm, and after years of use, the natural oils would make the fabric somewhat water-resistant. He thought about his business, about the careful relationships he'd built with weavers and dye-makers, with other merchants and with the officials who controlled access to markets. This alliance between Lagash and Amma, whatever its true purpose, was creating new opportunities but also new uncertainties. There's something almost meditative about imagining that desert camp, the small circle of firelight in vast darkness, the quiet breathing of sleeping donkeys, the slow wheel of stars overhead. The Sumerians were accomplished astronomers, tracking the movements of planets and stars, understanding that these celestial patterns correlated with the seasons and agricultural cycles. They knew the year had roughly 360 days, and they developed a calendar that required occasional adjustments to keep in alignment with the solar year. Sitting under that ancient sky, Nasir might have identified constellations we still recognize today, patterns his ancestors had been noting for millennia. He eventually slept, wrapped in his cloak near the dying fire, and dreamed of nothing in particular. The third day would bring them to Amma's gates, where the real purpose of this monitored journey would begin to reveal itself. But for now, there was just the desert night, the slowly cooling embers, and the patient stars bearing witness to stories both great and small, as they had for countless generations and would for countless more to come. Let your own breathing match the rhythm of that sleeping camp. Slow, steady, peaceful. The story moves forward, but you're safe and comfortable, drifting gently along with it. The city of Amma in 2397 BCE was smaller than Lagash but no less ambitious. Its ziggurat temple rose above the flat landscape like a mountain built by human determination, each level painted in different colors according to ritual specifications. The lowest level was black, representing the primordial waters of the abyss. Above it came white, then red, then blue, climbing toward the small shrine at the summit where priests performed the most sacred rites. When In-Nasir and his guarded caravan entered through the main gate, passing beneath the watchful gaze of clay statues depicting protective deities, he noticed the city seemed unusually busy for mid-morning. The marketplace was crowded with merchants who'd clearly come from various directions. He recognized the style of dress from several different cities: the distinctive striped robes worn in Uar, the elaborate headdresses favored in Nippur, the simple but well-made tunics of traders from smaller settlements. Something was happening, some convergence that went beyond normal market activity. The soldiers who'd accompanied him melted away into the crowd without explanation, leaving In-Nasir to make his way to the merchant quarter where he usually conducted his business. The merchant's house he sought belonged to a man named Lugalshah, a dealer in both textiles and precious materials who'd been In-Nasir's primary contact in Amma for nearly a decade. Their relationship had evolved from purely transactional to something resembling friendship, at least insofar as business competitors could be friends. Lugalshah's house was built around a central courtyard where a small garden grew, an extravagant use of precious water but a display of wealth that impressed visitors. In that courtyard, beneath the shade of a transplanted fig tree that must have cost a fortune to maintain, Lugalshah greeted In-Nasir with the customary embrace. You might find this little detail interesting. Figs had been cultivated in the region since at least 4000 BCE, making them one of humanity's oldest deliberately planted crops. Archaeological evidence suggests that figs might have been domesticated even before grains, offering our ancestors a reliable source of sweetness before honey became widely available. The figs from Mesopotamian trees were small but intensely flavorful, with flesh that ranged from amber to deep purple. Eaten fresh, they burst with honey juice. Dried, they became concentrated nuggets of energy that could last through the winter months. Lugalshah's tree was bearing fruit, and he plucked several figs as they settled to discuss business, the juice staining their fingers as they ate. But business wasn't really what Lugalshah wanted to discuss. After the initial pleasantries and a cursory examination of the linen In-Nasir had brought, his host leaned forward and spoke more quietly. He spoke of tablets, of an archive that was being compiled, of records that were being gathered from both cities and sealed away. The alliance between Lagash and Amma wasn't public knowledge among common citizens, but it wasn't entirely secret either. It existed in that strange middle space of things that informed people knew about but didn't openly discuss. Let me share with you what made this archive unusual. In a dedicated building near Amma's palace complex, scribes were creating a comprehensive record of the alliance, including not just diplomatic correspondence but detailed accounts of resource sharing, military coordination, and something called the preparations. These tablets were being marked with special seals and stored in a manner that suggested they weren't meant for routine access. Some were even being written in an archaic form of cuneiform that only the most educated scribes could read fluently, adding an extra layer of obscurity. Lugal Shah explained this because he wanted Nasir to understand that their business relationship was now part of a larger pattern. The textile trade between their cities wasn't just commerce, it was cover. Bolts of fine linen could conceal other items in a caravan. Merchants traveling regularly between the cities could observe and report on conditions without attracting suspicion. What had seemed like an easing of trade restrictions was actually the creation of an intelligence network disguised as commerce. Nasir felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. He wasn't a spy, hadn't trained for intrigue. He was a merchant who understood thread counts and dye quality, who knew which workshops produced the finest weaves and which customers paid most reliably. Now he was being told that his regular journeys had been subtly co-opted into something larger, that perhaps those soldiers had accompanied him not to guard his cargo but to observe how he reacted to what he saw along the route. They shared a meal in the courtyard as the afternoon heat began to ease. There was a rich lamb stew seasoned with leeks and coriander, the meat falling apart tender after hours of slow cooking in a clay pot. The leeks had been grown in the irrigated gardens outside the city, their mild onion flavor complementing the lamb's richness. There was also fresh bread, still warm, made from emmer wheat flour and shaped into flat rounds that you'd tear pieces from to scoop up the stew. And for afterward, there was a sweet made from crushed dates mixed with ground almonds and formed into small balls, dusted with a bit of precious cinnamon that had traveled along trade routes from distant lands where people spoke languages these Sumerians would never hear. That cinnamon is worth noting. In the 3rd millennium BCE, cinnamon was almost mythically rare in Mesopotamia. It came from regions so far away that its exact origin was unknown to most people, passed through so many intermediaries that its price multiplied many times over. Just a small amount was enough to flavor a whole dish, that warm, sweet spicy taste that seemed to contain sunlight. Lugal Shah served it because this meal was an occasion, a sealing of understanding between them. As they ate, Lugal Shah spoke more freely about the northern concern. He described reports of abandoned villages in the foothills, of refugees arriving with stories of crop failures and strange illnesses among their livestock. There were whispers of a new power consolidating in the mountains, though whether this was a military threat or something else remained unclear. The alliance between Lagash and Umma had been forged specifically to address this situation, to pool resources and information in the face of uncertainty. The archive being compiled was meant to be a comprehensive record that future administrators could reference. If the threat materialized, there would be a documented precedent for cooperation. If it didn't, the tablets would remain as evidence that their cities had been willing to set aside old grudges for mutual security. It was, in its own way, a kind of insurance policy written in clay. There's something comforting about the human impulse to record, to document, to leave evidence that we tried to understand and prepare for the challenges we faced. These Sumerian administrators and scribes, working in the warm light of oil lamps as evening fell over their cities, believed they were creating something that would matter. They chose their words carefully, pressed their styluses into the damp clay with precision, and then set the tablets aside to dry and harden. They couldn't have known that most of these records would be lost, that the archive they were so carefully constructing would be scattered by events they couldn't foresee. As darkness settled over Umma, Nasir was shown to a guest room in Lugal Shah's house. The room was simple but comfortable, with a raised sleeping platform covered in woven reed mats and cotton cloth. Cotton had only recently become available through trade with the Indus Valley civilizations, and it was still a luxury material, softer and lighter than the linen and wool that were traditional. He lay down as the sounds of the city gradually quieted, thinking about patterns and purposes, about how the simple act of transporting cloth had become something more complex, more consequential than he'd imagined. Outside his window, the stars were beginning their nightly journey across the sky. Somewhere in the palace complex, scribes were still working, their oil lamps burning late as they recorded the day's communications, the reports from watchtowers, the notes from merchants who'd seen things worth mentioning. The alliance was alive, active, a web of connections and agreements that spanned the distance between cities that had once been enemies. Let that image settle in your mind gently. The quiet city under the stars. The patient work of recording. The slow accumulation of knowledge that would someday, somehow, find its way to us. Your breathing is slow and easy now. The story continues to unfold, but there's no need to hold onto it tightly. Just let it flow past like a quiet stream. Autumn arrived early that year, or so the priest said after consulting the temple records and the patterns of star positions. The harvest moon rose fuller and brighter than usual, casting long silver shadows across the fields where barley stood ready for cutting. This was the season when the agricultural year's success or failure became undeniable, when granaries were either filled to abundance or worryingly sparse. In both Lagash and Umma, farmers worked from dawn until well past dusk, cutting the grain with bronze sickles, binding it into sheaves, transporting it to threshing floors where it would be beaten and winnowed. But this particular harvest season brought complications beyond the normal anxieties about yields and storage. The watchtowers that had been constructed throughout the summer were now fully staffed, and their signal fires could be seen at night, small orange points of light against the darkness. The frequency of these signals had increased, though their meaning remained obscure to most citizens. Merchants continued their routes between cities, but now they traveled in larger groups, and the inspections at gates had become thorough to the point of tedious. Let me tell you about the festival of Dumuzi, which occurred during this harvest season. Dumuzi was a god associated with fertility, shepherds, and the yearly cycle of growth and decay. His festival involved elaborate rituals where the king would symbolically take the role of Dumuzi, marrying the goddess Inanna in a ceremony that was meant to ensure the land's continued fertility. There would be processions, offerings, and communal feasting that brought the entire city together. This year, the festival in Lagash was different. Representatives from Umma were present, officially welcomed and given places of honor in the ceremonies. This was unprecedented and people noticed. The feast that concluded the festival was remarkable in its abundance. There were whole roasted sheep, the meat rubbed with herbs and garlic before being cooked slowly over pits filled with hot coals until the exterior was crispy and the interior remained juicy and tender. There were mountains of bread, both the everyday barley flatbreads and more elaborate versions made with wheat flour, some sweetened with honey and studded with raisins. The raisins were made from local grapes that grew in the irrigated areas, dried in the intense sun until they became concentrated bursts of sweetness that contrasted beautifully with the bread's weedy density. There were also enormous quantities of dates in various preparations. Fresh dates were piled in baskets, their skins taut and glossy. Dried dates were pressed into cakes with walnuts and spices. Date honey, a thick syrup made by boiling down the fruit, was drizzled over bread and mixed into beverages. The Mesopotamians had been cultivating date palms for millennia, and they developed dozens of varieties, each with subtly different flavors and textures. Some dates were best eaten fresh, soft and melting. Others were better dried, becoming chewy and intensely sweet. Still others were ideal for making into syrup or wine. You might find it interesting that date wine was actually quite sophisticated. The fermentation process required careful management of temperature and time, and the resulting beverage could range from mildly alcoholic and sweet to quite strong and dry, depending on the technique. It was typically served in small clay cups at important occasions, sipped slowly while conducting conversation or business. At this festival, date wine flowed freely, loosening tongues and creating an atmosphere of celebration that, for a few hours at least, made the alliance between the two cities feel natural rather than strategic. But beneath the celebration, currents of concern moved through the crowd. Yarnansha, the scribe we met in the first chapter, was present at the feast, seated with other scribal officials at a table near the temple steps. He'd spent months copying tablets related to the alliance, and he'd begun to notice patterns in the texts. The references to northern concern had evolved. Earlier tablets used the phrase sparingly, almost cautiously. More recent documents used it frequently and with increasing urgency. There were mentions of contingency plans, of supply caches being established, of evacuation routes being mapped. He found himself in conversation with a senior scribe from Amma, a woman named Ninshuber whose reputation for scholarship extended across multiple cities. She was older, perhaps 40, which was a considerable age in a time when life expectancy was unpredictable. Her hands were stained with ink and her eyes had the slight squint of someone who'd spent decades reading by lamplight. They spoke about technical matters at first, comparing the different clay sources their cities used, discussing the merits of various stylus materials. But eventually, their conversation turned to the texts they'd been working with. Ninshuber spoke carefully, aware that even at a festival, certain topics required discretion. She mentioned that the archive in Amma had been sealed 3 weeks prior. No explanation had been given to the scribes who'd been working on it. They'd simply arrived one morning to find the building guarded and their access revoked. The tablets they'd been compiling were considered complete, apparently, though several scribes felt that important documentation remained unfinished. There was a sense of haste, of a project being concluded prematurely because events were outpacing the careful pace of proper record-keeping. Yarnansha shared his own observations about the changing tone of the documents. They compared notes about specific tablets, about phrases that had appeared and then been deliberately edited in subsequent copies. There was a pattern of information being both recorded and obscured, as if the scribes were documenting events while also trying to control how much detail would be available to future readers. The evening grew later. Musicians played, their instruments creating melodies that had been passed down through generations. There were lyres with delicate, haunting tones, drums that provided rhythmic foundation, and clay flutes that cut through with bright, clear notes. People danced in the open spaces, simple line dances where everyone moved together, creating human patterns that mirrored the orderly rows of crops in the fields. Children, allowed to stay up far past their normal bedtime, wove between the adults, their faces sticky with date honey and their eyes bright with excitement. There's something deeply moving about these ancient celebrations, about the human need to gather and feast and dance, to create moments of joy and connection even when uncertainties loomed. These Sumerians weren't so different from us. They worried about their harvests and their children's futures. They formed friendships and rivalries. They created beauty through music and craftsmanship. And they tried to make sense of a world that often seemed unpredictable and occasionally threatening. As the festival wound down and people began the walk back to their homes through streets lit by oil lamps, Yuarnansha thought about the sealed archive in Umma, about all those tablets sitting in darkness, their messages frozen in clay. What would become of them? Would future scribes read them and understand the situation these documents described? Or would they remain mysteries, fragments of a story whose context had been lost? He arrived at his own home, a modest house he shared with his wife and 2 children. They were already asleep, and he moved quietly so as not to wake them. The remains of their own simpler celebration dinner were still on the table. A bowl containing a few pieces of flatbread, a small pot with some lentil stew that had been cooked with onions and cumin until the lentils were soft and the flavors had melded into something earthy and satisfying. He ate a bit of the cold stew, dipping the bread into it, tasting the cumin's warmth and the onion's sweetness. Outside, the harvest moon was setting, its light fading as dawn approached somewhere beyond the horizon. In a few hours, the work of another day would begin. Fields would continue to be harvested. Tablets would continue to be written. Watchtowers would continue to send their signals. The alliance would continue to function, that quiet cooperation between once rival cities, motivated by concerns that most citizens only dimly understood. Let yourself rest in this moment between celebration and new beginnings. Your body is comfortable and relaxed. The story moves through time, but you're anchored here, safe and peaceful. Just breathe and let the ancient world fade gently into the background of your thoughts. Winter came with unexpected force in the year 2396 BCE. Temperatures dropped lower than the oldest farmers could remember, and a cold wind from the north brought dust storms that darkened the sky and forced people to remain indoors for days at a time. The rivers that fed the irrigation systems ran lower than usual, and there were concerns about the spring planting season. It was during this difficult winter that the communications between Lagash and Umma changed in character. The watchtower signals became less frequent, then stopped altogether. This wasn't explained, and when merchants asked about it, they received vague responses about reassessments and new protocols. Nasir, making what would be his last journey between the cities for several months, noticed that the tower nearest the disputed territory had been abandoned. The platform remained, but the supplies of signal fires had been removed, and sand was already beginning to drift against the mud brick base. In the scriptorium at Lagash, Yuarnansha found himself assigned to different work. The diplomatic tablets that had occupied so much of his time were no longer arriving. Instead, he was copying mundane administrative documents, temple grain accounts, records of tool distributions to field workers, lists of livestock held in palace herds. It was necessary work but utterly routine, and after months of engaging with more consequential materials, he found it difficult to maintain focus. There's something almost melancholic about this shift, about the way ambitious projects can simply fade away without dramatic conclusions. The alliance between the cities hadn't been publicly dissolved. There was no announcement, no ceremony marking its end. It simply ceased to be active. The mechanisms that had been created, the watchtowers, the coordinated patrols, the merchant intelligence network, were quietly abandoned or repurposed. Let me share with you what daily life was like during that cold winter. People stayed close to their hearth fires, burning dried animal dung and precious wood to keep warm. The smoke from thousands of cooking fires hung over the cities in a hazy pall. Families huddled together under woolen blankets at night, conserving body heat. Food became simpler, relying on stored grains and preserved items rather than fresh produce. A typical winter meal might consist of a thick porridge made from barley groats, cooked slowly with water and a bit of fat until it becomes creamy and warming. To this basic dish, you might add whatever was available, some dried onions rehydrated and softened, perhaps a handful of lentils for protein and texture, maybe a spoonful of sesame paste for richness. The sesame paste, called tahini, had been a staple in the region for thousands of years. It was made by toasting sesame seeds until they released their oils, then grinding them into a smooth, nutty paste that added both flavor and substantial nutrition to simple dishes. For those who could afford it, there might also be preserved fish. The marshlands near the Persian Gulf provided abundant fishing grounds, and the catch was often salted or dried for transport inland. These preserved fish were intensely flavored, salty and pungent, and a small amount could season an entire pot of porridge or stew. You'd break off pieces and stir them in, letting the fish dissolve into the grain, creating a savory meal that provided warmth and sustenance through the long, cold nights. Children during this period had a different experience of winter than we might imagine. Without modern entertainment, they created their own amusements. They played with clay figurines, crafting small animals and people and acting out stories. They learned songs and riddles passed down through generations. And they were taught practical skills. Girls learned to spin and weave, while boys learned basic tool maintenance and animal husbandry. Education was happening constantly, woven into daily life rather than separated into formal institutions, except for the children of elite families who attended scribal schools. Yuarnanch's own children, a daughter of 7 and a son of 4, would sit with him in the evenings while he reviewed his work. His daughter was showing an aptitude for letters, and he'd begun teaching her some of the simpler cuneiform signs. She'd practice on old tablet fragments that had been deemed unimportant, using a broken stylus to press wedges into the clay. Her efforts were clumsy but enthusiastic, and watching her learn filled him with a quiet pride that had nothing to do with diplomatic intrigue or mysterious northern concerns. But he couldn't entirely forget about the sealed archive in Amma or the sudden cessation of communications. Sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, he'd think about those tablets sitting in darkness, their messages preserved but inaccessible. What had been the point of such careful documentation if it was simply going to be locked away? He'd heard rumors, vague and probably unreliable, that some tablets had been deliberately destroyed, broken apart, and their pieces scattered. But he had no way to verify such stories. You might find this detail interesting. The Sumerians had developed a practice of creating clay envelopes for important tablets. They'd form a thin layer of clay around a finished, dried tablet, creating a protective coating. Then they'd write a summary of the tablet's contents on this outer envelope and seal it with cylinder seals that rolled across the soft clay, leaving impressions of intricate designs that served as authentication marks. If you wanted to read the original tablet, you had to break the envelope, which meant the seal would be visibly broken, an early tamper evidence system. Some of the Alliance tablets had been protected this way, adding another layer of intentional obscurity to their contents. As winter gradually released its grip and the first signs of spring appeared, buds on the fig trees, returning birds, a subtle warming in the air, life in both cities resumed its more normal patterns. But the Alliance, that brief period of cooperation, had become something people didn't talk about much. It existed in the past tense, and while the tablets remained, those that hadn't been destroyed or lost, the living memory of why it had mattered began to fade. Nasir resumed his trading routes in early spring, But the journey between Lagash and Umma felt different now. The abandoned watchtower had begun to crumble, its mud brick returning slowly to the earth. The inspections at city gates had returned to their earlier, more casual form. And there was no longer that sense of being part of something larger, of commerce serving purposes beyond profit. It was just business again, which was simpler but somehow less interesting. He stopped one afternoon at the site where he'd camped that night with the soldiers, back when the Alliance had been active. The shrine to Ninjashida was still there, though some animal had knocked over the small clay figurines that travelers had left as offerings. He righted them carefully and left a small piece of honeycomb he'd been carrying, that golden treasure that bees built cell by cell, filled with sweetness that tasted of flowers and sunshine. The honey would attract ants and be gone by morning, but the gesture felt important somehow, a small acknowledgement of journeys taken and purposes served. There's a peacefulness in accepting that some stories don't have clear endings, that efforts made with good intentions can simply fade into silence without dramatic resolution. The Alliance had existed. It involved careful planning and substantial effort. And then it had ended quietly, like a lamp burning out when the oil finally ran dry. Let that gentle acceptance settle over you now. Not everything needs a climax or a revelation. Sometimes things simply are, and then they're over, and that's okay. Your breathing is slow and easy. The weight of the day has long since left your shoulders. The story continues for just a bit longer, but you're already drifting, comfortable and warm. 20 years have passed. Then 50. Then a century. The scribes who'd worked on the Alliance tablets grew old and died, their knowledge passing into the earth with them. The cities of Lagash and Umma continued their old patterns of competition and occasional conflict, the brief period of cooperation fading into the kind of historical footnote that might be mentioned by scholars but held little interest for common citizens. The archive in Umma, that collection of sealed tablets, remained in its designated building, though the structure's original purpose was gradually forgotten. It became a storage facility for various administrative materials, then a workshop where craftsmen repaired ceramic vessels, and finally, after a fire damaged part of the building, it was partially abandoned. The tablets, those careful records of an alliance created to face a threat that never fully materialized, sat buried under debris and generations of dust. In 2300 BCE, roughly a century after the alliance had faded, a group of Gutian raiders did sweep down from the northern mountains, bringing chaos to the Sumerian city-states. They weren't organized or numerous enough to establish permanent control, but for several decades they disrupted the established order, demanding tribute and occasionally sacking cities that resisted. It's tempting to wonder if this was the northern concern that the alliance had been preparing for, but the timing doesn't quite match. The threat had been anticipated earlier, and by the time it arrived, no coordinated response existed to address it. Let me tell you what happened to our characters, insofar as the tablets allow us to know. Yornansha continued working as a scribe until his death at the age of 48, which was considered a good lifespan. A brief funerary inscription found on a tablet fragment mentions his skill and dedication. His daughter, who'd learned to read and write despite this being uncommon for women, married a merchant and likely managed his business correspondence, though direct evidence of this is thin. Nasir's fate is unrecorded. He probably continued trading until age or illness prevented it, then passed his routes and contacts to a son or nephew. The patterns of commerce he'd participated in continued long after any individual merchant was gone. Textiles traveled from Lagash to Umma and beyond. Goods flowed along routes that had been established centuries earlier and would continue for centuries more. Nin Shubur, the senior scribe from Umma, was mentioned in a palace administrative document as having been appointed to oversee a temple library, a position of significant respect. She would have spent her final years surrounded by tablets, organizing and preserving knowledge, a guardian of the written word in an era when literacy was rare and precious. The actual tablets of the alliance were scattered by various disasters over the following centuries. Some were lost in fires that destroyed buildings. Others were deliberately buried when cities were rebuilt, used as fill material in foundation trenches. A few were carried off by looters or conquerors, ending up in locations far from where they'd been created. And some simply remained buried in place, waiting beneath accumulated layers of earth and time. You might find it interesting that Mesopotamian cities were often built on top of their own ruins. When buildings collapsed or were demolished, instead of clearing away all the debris, new structures would be built directly on top, raising the city's elevation gradually over centuries. This created tells, artificial mounds that contained layer after layer of human habitation like the rings of a tree. When archaeologists excavate these tells, they're literally digging through time, each layer representing a different era. In 1877 CE, a French archaeological expedition led by Ernest de Sarzec began excavating at Tello, the site of ancient Lagash. They found thousands of tablets, many broken, many jumbled together without clear provenance. Among these were fragments that mentioned the alliance with Umma, though the archaeologists of that era didn't fully understand what they'd found. The tablets were shipped to museums in Paris and elsewhere, where they sat in storage for decades, waiting for scholars who could properly read and contextualize them. The story of how these tablets were deciphered is itself fascinating. Cuneiform had been lost as a readable script for nearly 2,000 years. It required brilliant linguistic detective work by scholars who compared inscriptions in multiple languages, gradually teasing out the meanings of signs and the grammar of long-dead languages. By the early 20th century, the basics of Sumerian were understood, though many nuances remained elusive. Scholars studying the Lagash tablets eventually pieced together evidence of the alliance. They found references that corresponded with similar tablets from other sites. They noticed patterns in the dating and content. Slowly, the outline of this brief cooperation between rival cities emerged from the fragmentary evidence. But many questions remained unanswered. The northern concern was never explicitly defined in the tablets that survived. The reason for the alliance's sudden cessation was never documented, or, if it was, those tablets were among the many that didn't survive. There's something profoundly beautiful about this fragmentary survival, about how tiny pieces of clay can carry voices across 4,000 years. Those scribes pressing their styluses into damp clay tablets had no concept of us, no way to imagine people in an utterly foreign future reading their careful words. Yet here we are, connected to them by nothing more than the durability of fired clay and the human impulse to record, to document, to leave traces of our existence. Think about your own life for a moment. What traces are you leaving? What small actions or words might echo further than you expect? The Sumerians who created these tablets were simply doing their jobs, fulfilling their responsibilities as scribes and officials. They weren't trying to speak to the future. They were solving problems in their present. Yet their work survived, and it speaks to us still, telling us about human concerns that remain remarkably constant: security, cooperation, the challenge of facing uncertain threats, the desire to leave accurate records. As we bring this gentle journey to a close, let yourself hold lightly to these images. Clay tablets in the darkness, waiting. Ancient cities beneath modern desert. The patient scratches reed styluses on wet clay. The taste of date honey and barley bread. The light of oil lamps in scriptorium windows. The quiet dedication of people who did their work carefully, never knowing it would matter millennia later. The alliance between Lagash and Umma collapsed into mystery, yes, but the fragments remain. They're in museums now, properly catalogued and studied, available to scholars who continue to analyze and interpret. Each new reading might reveal some small detail previously overlooked. Each new archaeological discovery might add context. The story isn't finished because we're still finding pieces of it, still trying to understand what those ancient administrators were concerned about, why they created such an elaborate system, and what ultimately caused it to fade away. Your own day has faded now, and you're here in this quiet moment, comfortably resting, your thoughts drifting like dust motes in ancient sunlight. The mysteries of the past can rest alongside you, neither solved nor forgotten, simply present in their quiet way. Thank you for traveling through this gentle piece of history with me. Thank you for listening as we walked through ancient cities and sat at festival tables, as we followed merchants on desert routes and watched scribes at their patient work. If you drifted into peaceful sleep somewhere along the way, I'd be glad. That's exactly as it should be. And if you made it all the way to this whispered ending, if you're still here listening to these final words, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what part of the journey stayed with you. May your dreams be calm and your rest deep. May you wake refreshed, carrying perhaps just the faintest echo of ancient cities in the back of your mind, a small reminder that we're all connected through vast chains of time to people who lived and worked and worried and celebrated, just as we do. Sweet dreams, friends. Sleep well.